Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our webinar today on using a risk management framework to elevate your cybersecurity program. My name is Jingsung Zhao, and I am a director of content marketing at Hyperproof, and I'm moderating this webinar today. Welcome, glad to have you here. Before we get started, just want to give you guys a few tips about what will happen today. So this webinar is being recorded, and you will be able to access the webinar with the same link you had used to register this event. So it'll just turn into an on-demand video. We will also email you a link to the recording after the webinar is over. And then, during this conversation, we also really want to hear from you. We want to hear your questions. So when you have a question, you can type them into the question box. We have dedicated time at the end of the talk for Q&A. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker, James Gomez, today. I hope you will find our conversation today informative and really relevant to your day-to-day work. I have personally met James a few times over the past few months, and I've really enjoyed just hearing his perspective on cybersecurity, compliance, and risk management topics. So James is a subject matter expert in these areas with over 35 years of IT experience. He is currently the managing partner at Cybersec Consulting, a firm that offers consulting services to help organizations minimize risk, achieve compliance, and protect data assets in order to achieve their organizational vision, maximizing corporate value. James has served as an interim CISO, compliance director, IT auditor, project manager, cyber security analyst, consultant, and systems engineer. And he's worked in a variety of industries, including rocket science, aerospace, healthcare, banking, finance, accounting, automotive, and computer manufacturing at a variety of different Fortune 500 companies. James, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. Welcome.
Thank you, Jin Kong. Glad to be here.
Oh, so let's, I'm just gonna leave this slide open for a moment. These are kind of our conversation areas for today. And so let's just jump in. So first question, James, how did you become a CISO? Why did you choose this path?
Well, it's kind of an interesting question. I think I actually began my career as an engineer, as an SE, working for EDS a long time ago. And what I learned really was, even though my background in my undergraduate degree was in computer science, I ended up actually missing the people side of what the business had. So I slowly tried to move and transition kind of out of being kind of a programmer that was, kind of locked in a room and you throw pizza under the door, to kind of being somebody that would actually have the ability to be able to talk and meet with people. So I became a project manager and a DBA. I transitioned and worked in several companies during that path, and probably about I think it was about 20 years ago, what I ended up doing was actually going back to graduating my MBA and trying to get completely out of, and I shouldn't say away from IT, and get more into the business side, because that was an interest that I had. Well, during that time frame, what I really ended up doing was getting into the area of compliance after I got out of graduate school, and that led me to kind of doing and being an auditor. And I learned about Sarbanes-Oxley, believe it or not, in graduate school. And when I got out of graduate school, that was the first thing I did, was become a Sarbanes-Oxley auditor. And then from there, I ended up, slowly getting into IT security, and I had been doing that before from an IT perspective. And eventually, I could see kind of where the industry was headed, and so that's kind of how I ended up being a CISO. It's pretty interesting. I had a professor in undergraduate school, and he used to always say, never take a job unless you know where your next job is going to be. So I've kind of always used that as a philosophy and said, okay, this is where the industry is. This is where I am. How do I get to that next place? So.
Thanks for sharing that. Appreciate it. So we've all seen many companies get breached, and I've seen a stat that there were over 2,000 confirmed cases of data breaches in just half of 2019. And meanwhile, according to Forrester, companies are predicted to spend 12.6 billion on cloud security tools by 2023, up from 5.6 billion in 2018. So spending is going up. And you've said that all of this is evidence that there's a disconnect in organizations between their cybersecurity, IT, risk management, and compliance activities. Can you tell us more about what you mean when you're saying there is a disconnect?
Sure. So kind of what I see is that most organizations, what they do is that they have these three areas: cybersecurity, IT, risk management, and compliance. Those are kind of siloed. So you have people in the cybersecurity team that report up to a CIO, and they're kind of sometimes in their own little corner, if you will, working and doing all their cybersecurity activities. And to a certain extent, cybersecurity is actually being integrated into IT. Those trainings and cybersecurity awareness and understanding, okay, you can't do these things anymore as an administrator, is actually bleeding over into IT. But where I think the challenge lies is that there is this risk management. Organizations typically have a risk management organization, and that may or may not necessarily be in IT. It typically is in the business. And then they have a compliance group, and that compliance group kind of is it kind of has a dual area between IT and legal and all of those other areas. So where the challenge is that because these organizations are so disparate and siloed, they don't necessarily get on the same page, if you will, when looking at and measuring risk, which I think is one of the things that is detrimental and can be detrimental to organizations. So from my perspective and where I see things typically as an outsider looking in and coming in, one of the things that I really try to encourage people to do is to look at it not as three separate distinct activities, but to try to take these activities and put them into one place. And what I mean by that is that there is, when you're looking at cybersecurity, you're considering risk management. When you're looking at compliance, you're looking at cybersecurity and risk management. That way, what you're doing is that you're minimizing corporate risk, and the reality is that you're achieving corporate value. You're increasing corporate value by doing that. I think that's one of the big things where organizations sometimes miss and don't necessarily take the best approach.
Got it. That makes sense. So to that point, from your perspective, what does it mean to be a risk-aware organization to look at this in an integrated way?
Well, again, I think that is a great question. And risk-aware organizations are those organizations that actually understand that their day-to-day activities are tied to risk. Because as a corporate ongoing concern, what an organization should be doing is that they should be thinking about, what am I doing right now, and is this creating a sense of exposure for the organization? And what I'm doing today is that actually going through and opening up the company to fines, penalties, and legal actions. If you go through and you were talking about breaches earlier, one of the things that is often that comes up is that when you look at insider threat, when you look at phishing attacks and ransomware, these kinds of things sometimes happen because somebody is going through clicking on a link, gaining access, elevating hackers going through and elevating their access. So organizations have to begin to start thinking about how they're going through and making sure that they are secure. So an organization that does that is going to be risk aware. Um, so that includes, and there's some other things that are involved with that. As an example, understanding what a risk management framework is and what that risk management framework is tied to your organization. So let's say I'm a healthcare organization. Well, everybody understands that there are HIPAA um, guidelines. So in an ideal world, what you're doing and what everybody's doing from the top to the bottom is that you're going through and you're ensuring that what you're doing is not, again, exposing the organization. And organizations that typically don't comply with their recommended RMF, they can typically face dire consequences from governing bodies for not doing that. And as an example, you can look at breaches that have happened, especially in the area of healthcare. You'll find that OCR, Office of Civil Rights, comes and they may do an audit to determine whether they failed on a particular set of controls or weren't doing things that they should have been doing, and then that determines the actual fines and penalties, because they can go from several hundred to several $1,000s per record in terms of their fines. So that's kind of really where the challenge is, and especially with smaller organizations. Additionally, smaller organizations, when they do get breached or they have been breached, sometimes they never recover. So where the challenge is making sure that they're doing everything that they should be doing, especially if they're a healthcare organization. They may have client data where they have credit card numbers and different things like that. So they should be ensuring that they're following a set of PCI controls. So a risk management framework essentially is what I mean, and what I say when I say a risk-aware organization. They understand where their risks are. They've implemented and are looking at a risk management framework, and they understand how those risks are tied to cybersecurity and compliance.
Got it. So of course there's sort of the regulatory requirement for certain industries like healthcare to implement a risk management framework, but then there are other industries that, like technology, that are less regulated to where they don't have to, but it would still be why is it beneficial for organizations to align their security and compliance program to a risk management framework, even if they don't have to?
Well, I'm going to kind of use an analogy here of baking a cake. And let's say, and it's kind of interesting because one of my favorite kind of cakes is German chocolate. I actually had a German chocolate cake this weekend. And essentially what risk management is, let's say I wanted to bake a cake. Typically what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to get a recipe, I'm going to get ingredients, and then I'm going to have an oven. And those are, if you actually correlate that to what we're talking about here, I would say that risk management is kind of that recipe for the cake. Cybersecurity tools are the actual ingredients for the cake, and compliance is actually the oven, the frosting, and your taste buds to determine whether the cake came out the way that you like it. And without a recipe and a description of what the precise ingredients are, you can essentially end up with one of several different things. You could have taken that cake and you could end up with bread, biscuits, tortillas, hardtack. But unless you actually put that recipe and you follow that recipe, it's the only way to ensure that what you put into it is what you get out of it. So taking that risk first approach, what that does is that it kind of increases the likelihood of minimizing risk. And it also helps and makes sure that you actually go through and you minimize risk in a proper order. Um, so that can help and ensure that what you do in your cybersecurity and you go through and pick your tools and technologies, um, it can drive the requirements for that. And as an example, let's say I'm using NIST 800-171 and I'm going through and implementing those controls. Well, if I look at the 3.1 section, which is access controls, those controls can tell me, okay, I need to go through, as an example, and implement a privileged access management tool because I failed in securing high privilege access user accounts, as an example. So you can use a risk management framework and the controls and a failure of the controls or deficiency to ensure that your cybersecurity tools are implemented in a proper order. And then you can go through and make sure that your compliance, that once you've implemented those tools, that it's actually truly minimizing the risk the best that it possibly can be.
That makes sense. I like what you said about it's a way to ensure that things are done in a proper order so that it's basically it's making the most of existing resources, is making sure resources go to the right areas according to risks, right? So there are a lot of different risk management frameworks that exist today. Which particular ones should organizations become familiar with and consider? Do you have like top 2 or 3 you would recommend?
That is kind of a tricky question. And it really kind of, when you are talking about implementing a risk management framework, in my opinion, and just from experience as well too, um, and kind of this is where our organization actually goes through and does these kinds of things, is that let's say we're a healthcare organization, and you have the end result of going through and wanting to implement HIPAA. Well, what most organizations do is that they go through and they try to implement HIPAA on their own by themselves, and they become completely overwhelmed. And they end up saying, you know what, this is an impossible task. Because really, when you're implementing a risk management framework, you're changing the DNA of your organization. You're really changing the way that your company operates. And it's not just IT, it's the business as well too. How they get access, how they gain access, how you remove access, how you terminate access, all of those things, how you implement changes, all those things can be defined in a risk management framework. So in an ideal world, what you do is you try to choose a framework that is somewhat simplified. And what I mean by that is many organizations, what we typically do is that we'll go through and we'll implement NIST 800-171. And then what we do is that we cross map on top of that. We'll throw the HIPAA and the data privacy and the security controls and guidelines on top of that, and then determine what that we didn't cover in NIST needs to be covered by HIPAA. And then that makes it a smaller lift. So what you're doing is that you're just doing basically work breakdown structure. You're trying to implement a lower set of controls and then put the other controls on top of that. And then eventually what happens, and I can give you examples. I mean, there's organizations that we consulted with and that we work with where, they're obviously taking credit cards and things like that for deductibles and different things. So they have to implement a set of PCI controls. So again, that's an additional framework that goes in on top of the HIPAA and on top of the NIST 800-171.
That makes sense. So okay, if you were to say, okay, so basically if there are multiple frameworks, right, that an organization needs to become compliant with, they don't want to get overwhelmed. What would you say are kind of the key things to keep in mind so that it's an easier exercise and it's an efficient exercise? And I know you just mentioned some already, but just are there any others you would add?
So I think the big thing is that when you're rolling out a risk management framework, I'll just refer to what I said earlier, which is in an ideal world, you have to consider and think about you're changing the DNA of your company. Um, you're taking that, whole concept of becoming risk aware and you're making that real. So, it's not just about implementing controls. Controls are tied to policies, and those policies are typically tied to procedures or SOPs. So, administrators, developers may have just operated in a willy-nilly kind of way, if you will, and so now they have to operate in a much more structured way. But in my opinion, and this is typically what we do as a practice, is that we'll take a smaller set of controls and we'll start someplace like right in the middle. And what I mean by that is like change management. Change management, most organizations, because of ITIL and different things like that, they will go through and they already typically have good practice around the concept of how they do and execute changes. So in an ideal world, that's what they're doing. They're going through and they're implementing changes in a structured way. So what I would recommend is start there. Start with change management and then work your way out. Then look at access management or access control. Um, Look at administration. Look at network. Those are the places and those are the kinds of the things that I try to do just to make sure that you don't get overwhelmed when you're implementing a set of controls. Um, I hope that makes sense. But in an ideal world, you're not going through and just trying to do everything all at once. You're trying to structure it and kind of put it in a project plan and do it over the course of several days. I shouldn't say several days, several months. You're not trying to do it over several days. That's what you should do in an ideal world.
And you're trying to implement your high risk controls first, before your medium controls and lower risk controls.
And that is an excellent point, and that's another thing that you try to do as well too, because most organizations, the the controls are just are guidelines. You're taking those controls and interpreting them, and then saying this is how they work in my organization. Uh, but in an ideal world, it's not just doing that. It's also going through and defining which controls are high risk for you as a company, and then going through and determining what the medium ones are and what the low risks are. So I've seen risk management frameworks take several years to actually go and implement, where they'll do the high risk controls first, and then go through the next year and do the medium risk controls, and then the next year come through and do the low risk controls. Um, and during that whole time, you're going through and doing that reiterative process, implementing controls, checking the controls, making sure they're compliant, adjusting your cybersecurity toolkit, making sure that those things are covering your risks, and just going through and doing that reiterative process over and over again.
So that brings me to my next question, which is, everything goes back to what your actual risks are. Let's talk about risk assessments. So risk assessments are pretty critical to making sure then that you're implementing the right controls and doing it kind of in the right order, right? So is there an ideal approach to conducting a risk assessment in your opinion, so you're not missing something important?
Well, yeah, I think what you really have to do is, and I think that is where the challenge is when risks are not classified properly. And again, it's one of those areas. I think it's one of the big disconnects between cybersecurity, risk management, and compliance. And kind of, I'm a firm believer that you can't lock down what you don't understand. And that's really where you're trying to do with a risk assessment. You're trying to go through organizationally and look at where your risk is, number one, and then go through and make sure that you lock down that risk or minimize that risk as much as possible. So, and I'd like to, I mean, there's what I what I talk about that is that, as an example, there's I remember there was one time I got called into an organization to actually go through and do a risk assessment, and this organization was in the process of getting acquired by a multi-billion-dollar company, and they were a small, medium-sized company. And so they said, okay, come in and do this risk assessment. And I said, sure. And we went through and started going through and doing the the physical work and doing walkthroughs and different things like that. And then the idea is that we were going to go through and do the evidence and gather the evidence and test the controls. Well, I walked through their physical data place and went through and looked at their data center where they had all of their data. And this organization was, it actually had like several million um, uh, private social security numbers and financial data. And when I was going through and doing that physical audit, I walked through and I looked at the server room, and they said, oh, we went through and secured the room, we secured everything. And I looked around and said, you know, if you give me 5 minutes, I can break into your server room. And they said, well, I don't think you can. Just go around the corner and I will break into your server room and I won't trigger any alarms. Well, what they did is that they had been in a retail space in an industrial park, and they had one of those fail-safe roofs. And so what I did is I went into the conference room and I grabbed a chair, pushed one of those tiles aside, got into the roof, climbed over into the room, and jumped down and got into the server room. And so they came back later and I'm standing in the server room and they're like, how did you do that? And I said, well, you forgot to build. When you had this server room built, they didn't build all the way to the ceiling, and they should have actually went through and secured that thing above your fail-safe roof. So that's an example of, in my opinion, you can't lock down what you don't know or what you don't understand. So it's one of those things that risk assessments are one of those things that you just, okay, it's almost hard to do a self-assessment to a certain extent. I think it is sometimes like if I needed to go to the doctor, but instead of going to the doctor, I take my temperature, take my heartbeat. And I'm not saying that you can't do that, but sometimes it's good to get that outside exterior opinion as far as where your risks are. So that's one thing. And then I think the second thing is making sure that you go through and inventory all of your assets. If you look at the NIST recommendations for going through and doing a risk assessment or implementing a risk management framework, one of the things that they talk about, and it's one of the first steps that many people miss, which is actually going through and inventorying your applications, your software, your data, and your hardware to ensure that, again, just to use the point, you can't lock down what you don't know. But more importantly, you can't lock down and know what you don't have. I've worked in organizations where they have, shadow apps, where they have applications and production data under somebody's desk that's not necessarily plugged into a network. That can be detrimental to an organization if somebody just were to grab that server and walk out. There may be intellectual property in there. There may be customer or research data in there. That's oftentimes what you find in hospitals. That they'll create their own shadow app and they have their own server in their own lab, and it's not tied into a network. It's not being backed up. It's not being secured in any shape or form. So that's kind of one of the things you do. And then finally, what you do is that you go through, you assign risk ratings to those assets, and based in that risk is the ability to categorize the potential loss if the asset is compromised, if it's stolen or it's breached. And then what you do is that you rate your controls based upon those assets, and then you input that into your controls. So that will tell you how to go through and where to implement your controls in terms of order and criticality.
Thank you. Thank you especially for sharing that example about the server that was not secure. That's really helpful. So that's now, okay, well, you've talked a bit about the sort of how to conduct a detailed risk assessments. The work isn't done yet. You have, let's say you put controls in place based on the inputs of your risk assessments, but then a risk and compliance team, they still need to monitor and review those controls to make sure they're effective, especially as things can change in their organization as they purchase new applications, for instance, or where there's changes in the org structure. So when organizations are running a compliance program day to day, what are some common issues they often miss that could jeopardize the effectiveness of their compliance program? What have you seen, James?
Well, it's a great question, and I think there is. I mean, I could give you a list that's probably a mile long, but I think that one of the things that organizations don't typically do is that they, and this is where the challenge is going through and ticking and tying um, your risk management framework, which is a set of controls, ticking tying those to policies, and then ticking tying those to procedures or SOPs, and then ensuring that all of those are in alignment. It's a big effort to actually go through and do that. Number one. Number two is then and this is the next step where organizations don't necessarily make sure that um, new employees, say an organization transfers somebody from one department to another. Let's say I'm a developer and I want to become a systems administrator. Well, that developer may have a set of job duties and responsibilities in development that's different than somebody that's in a systems administration role. So in an ideal world, where you're going and what you're looking at is that you're looking at, okay, I've got this, I've got a new job, I've got new responsibilities, I've got new procedures. Am I going through and ensuring that that person actually knows what their day-to-day duties are? That's where the compliance, risk management, cybersecurity all gets tied together. Because that person could go through and do something on one day that makes their where they actually cause a deficiency in a control. So that can be something that is vitally important. So you know you can, and again, I'll go through some other things as well. So there's we just talked about job changes. I think about the other thing is assigning owners. In an ideal world, what you have is you have somebody that has the ownership of the control, and then you have the other person or people that are doing that, and that is a control operator. So an owner is typically going to be a supervisor or a team lead, whereas an operator is going to be the individual contributors that are going through and doing the work. So making sure that they receive and understand policies and procedures and understand the updates to those. Because let's say I'm a compliance guy and I go through and I update a policy or procedure. Well, if I go through and do that, what I should be doing is I should be making sure that the operators, first of all, communicating that to the owner, and then making sure that the operators are actually going through and understanding how their procedure has changed and making sure that they're operating in that new way. Um, so those are kind of some of the things that I see. And oftentimes back in the day, like when I was doing hands-on audit kind of stuff, that's where I would see where programs, compliance programs would fail, is that they would somebody in the executive office of the CIO would go through, make some changes to a policy, and then the procedure wouldn't get changed, or they would make changes to a policy, make changes to a procedure, and they didn't communicate that change to a control owner or control operator.
That makes a lot of sense. So let's just get a little bit more specific, right? Since you have audited a lot of organizations, what are the top reasons that organizations fail their audit or get a qualified opinion?
Well, I think there's several. One is invalid, or I would say inappropriate test criteria. And what I mean by that, let's say that there is a change management control, and that change is implemented, and then let's say after the change is implemented, somebody doesn't go through and confirm that the change request that was requested was actually what was implemented. They didn't allow the user to actually go through and test that the requirements or request actually equaled what was changed. That essentially means, in that particular example, that would mean that your change management process is broken. So in an ideal world, what you're trying to do is that you're trying to make sure that what the requirements of the control is really truly what was tested. So, and I've seen it before where I've been working in a place where I'm either part of an internal audit team or I'm doing some external audit work for, and the internal auditor had went through and tested something, and the test criteria didn't meet what the requirements of the control mandated. So, so creating appropriate test criteria for controls needs to be a part of your risk management framework. It needs to be a part of your controls. So when you have a control, you have that test criteria, and you know test criteria 1, test criteria 2, test criteria 3 for that control, so that when you're going through and testing it, that you know that that control is operating effectively. And then another area, and this is one of the things that I see where organizations sometimes miss, is in the area of control frequency. And what I mean by that is they may have a control that, let's say it's categorized as a weekly control, meaning that that particular event that the control has in its realm of influence, that control happens 4 times a month. Well, let's say it increases, for whatever reason, it increases up to 15 to 20 times. Well, that control just became not a weekly control. That control became a daily control. And so as a compliance person, you're going through and you're saying, oh, I'm based upon the frequency of the control. That's how you randomly test and gather the sample. So if it's a weekly control, you may gather 1 sample or whatever. But on a daily control, you want to do maybe 2 or 3 to ensure that the control is operating effectively. So that's kind of the other thing too. You want to make sure that the activity of a control is tied to the actual number of times that the event occurs in an organization. And sometimes those controls are not changed, if that makes sense.
Do you have like a specific example for a control there, just to make it more concrete for people?
Yes, and this is one where I think there was an organization where they were doing periodic access reviews, and what happened is that they had some, and this is one area where organizations sometimes don't necessarily, where they sometimes have difficulty, is terminations or transfers. And so what happened is that they would go one organization was going through and taking transfers, and they were executing transfers instead of it being a once a month kind of thing where they would take somebody's access, remove it over here, and then grant access over here. It started happening where they started doing it weekly. So instead of doing it monthly, they were doing it weekly, but they didn't change the frequency of the control. Well, that meant that the compliance department wasn't essentially going through and actually gathering the appropriate amount of evidence to ensure that the control was operating effectively. So that's where, and the administrators and the people that were granting and removing the access, they were doing something different than what the control stated. So that's where I think, in that whole loop, there was a whole, there's HR, there's IT, there's people that are granting and moving access in the provisioning department within the IT group. So all of those 3 people hadn't necessarily synced up, and the control failed because everybody was doing things on a different frequency.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great example. Well, so basically, running an effective compliance program, it kind of requires different people, frequent communication happening in the right places, reviews of controls, and that is pretty hard to do effectively and consistently without technology, right? And you have, implemented different GRC tools for various organizations. But you said to me in our previous conversation, GRC tools itself is a misnomer. Why do you think it's a misnomer? And how do you think about the value GRC tools can or should provide?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think the big thing that we oftentimes look at is that oftentimes with GRC tools, they're really the way that they're thought of is they're just checking a box. You got to control. Did it operate effectively? Yes or no? Check a box. Um, did they do the evidence and did they check the evidence? Check the box. So um, what I mean by this is that risk management and GRC, um, it really should be a part of what I call RMF and being risk aware. So risk management is strategic. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes as engineers, and I'm one, when I get involved and when we get involved in implementing cybersecurity tools, we look at things from a tactical perspective. Oh, I have these control deficiencies or these control failures, and I need to go through and implement a privileged access management tool. And that'll take care of this control, and this control. And once I've implemented it, boom, I check the box, go, I move on to the next one. But the reality is that you can't look at these tools when you are looking at things like threat kill chain, APT, ladder controls. What you should be doing is that you have to look at it as an overall process and how am I minimizing the risk in that overall threat kill chain. And threat kill chain is really somebody gains access to your system, somebody goes sideways, somebody elevates their access, and then somebody takes that data and spins it out, which we call data leakage, right? So in an ideal world, what you're trying to do is that you're trying to go through and look at each and every one of the tools, and those tools are based upon what your GRC theoretically is telling you, or your risk management framework. And typically, what I've done and what our organization does and what we do when we go through and look at an organization, we recommend that they start with a cursory set or assessment of the controls that is based upon their industry or what they should be doing. And then that helps us determine what their cybersecurity toolkit looks like. And I've went into multi-billion-dollar organizations before where they've been breached and their cybersecurity toolkit wasn't up to snuff. So what we do is that you could go through and say, okay, well, let's just go through and do some upgrades, but that's not really what you should be doing. The reality is that you should be looking at your risks and then let that drive what your cybersecurity roadmap and toolkit looks like. That will help, again, create and put in the right tools at the right time in the right place. And it will help ensure that you stay in compliance and you meet your regulatory requirements so that when there is a breach, not if, when there is a breach, that you have done the best that you can to minimize the risk. And so when external people come in and look at what you've done, that they can actually say, yes, we've done, this has been done, and and we can see the tools and the steps that they did to minimize the risk. As an example, there's a particular healthcare organization where I did a use case study on it, and one of the things I looked at when this company was fined several $1 million by OCR, but if you look at the root cause, the OC auditors came in and they actually did a test and looked at what they did, and they said, well, here's what they failed to do. They failed to implement the proper risk management framework, which is and again, that's what organizations are doing. They're going through and they're saying, oh, we checked the box, we did it, we're fine. But I think it kind of speaks to how risk management and cybersecurity and compliance weren't talking together. That's a classic example of those three organizations not working properly, because if they had, they would have found that they had thought they addressed the risk, but the reality is that they hadn't. And they probably, from the results of what I've seen, they may have not necessarily gotten it breached, or they probably wouldn't have had the multi-million-dollar lawsuit and fines and penalties that they have.
That makes sense. And so I guess I'm also really curious, right? It's been a pretty interesting and kind of extraordinary year. There's definitely a lot that has changed in terms of cyber risk, just due to the fact that we've all now had to work remotely, and that means that security controls, that were meant for physical work environments are not relevant anymore. We've all had to adapt. So I'm curious to hear what trends you think will become even more important next year. What should security and compliance leaders be thinking about or be prepared for?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I think that there's multiple trends on the horizon, and some of them are not as obvious as others. I believe that one of the trends that you will see for this upcoming year, 2021, is just this subject that we're talking about right now. Because here's where the challenge is that um, it's almost where cybersecurity guys, CISOs, we've gotten to the point where we're overwhelmed with the amount of tools and the amount of technologies that are out there. There's hundreds of tools and technologies out there to do SIM, to do threat intelligence, to do encryption, to do privilege access management. I mean, as an example, you can look at maybe 3 or 4 years ago there were maybe only 2 or 3 companies that were doing privilege access management pretty good. Now there's several, and what I mean by several, there's probably 10. So at some point in time, everybody's competing and doing the same things in the same processes, doing the same activities. So what I predict is that okay, those cybersecurity toolkits are well and good. Implementing and covering your basic 15-20 areas that you would pick out of a cybersecurity roadmap, and implementing those initiatives, that's a well and good exercise. Where I think the next level up is where cybersecurity begins to talk to risk management, and that risk management person may be in legal. It may be somebody that is there may be a risk management committee where you have a CISO, a CIO, the CFO is part of it, and a compliance person. And those guys get together, they sit in a room and they say, okay, what are we doing to minimize our risk? Well, actually, what the first thing they're doing is they're asking what are the applicable risk management frameworks that we should be thinking about to ensure and minimize the amount of exposure that we have in our company is not what it can or what it should be. So that's the thing, and they meet on a frequent basis. It's a monthly meeting, and they're saying, okay, we handle this risk. The cyber guys will say, okay, we hired this risk, we minimize this risk, this risk, this risk. These are the tools that we implemented, and here's where our roadmap is. Which is typically an 18 to 36 month program to actually go through and minimize your risk. But that's kind of what's happened, and this is the progress of those. And then the risk guy sits down and says, okay, we're taking and looking at the tools that that the CISO and the CIO you guys are implementing, and these are the risks that they're covering. Because let's say you have areas, let's say it's vulnerability management, and you have some areas, some open holes that you see for a vulnerability management program, making sure that your patches and your servers are updated. By the way, some of the biggest breaches that have happened in the first part of when people were doing their cybersecurity was because vulnerability management wasn't a priority to them. And you can go Google that and figure out who the organizations are. But there are organizations that are out there that didn't think that vulnerability management was the best thing to do, and then they got breached, and then it became a thing. So I think that's going to be I think that's going to be one of the big things for this next one of the top trends, that organizations are going to start looking at risk management and saying, let's use risk management to drive our cybersecurity roadmap, and then that roadmap toolkit can then go through and create the proper the proper compliance program.
That's really interesting. Thanks for that. Are there any last thoughts or kind of comments you want to make, James, before we transition into Q&A?
Well, I think again, I think that, and this is kind of what our organization is doing and what we do, is that let's say you are as an organization, you get breached, um, or you have had some kind of exposure. What we typically do, and this is kind of one of the first things, believe it or not, that we actually try to get organizations to consider. And I know that this is outside of this necessarily the scope of what we do, but it's what we ask people is, and this is actually one of the other big trends that I think is going to be big next year, is the concept of cybersecurity liability insurance. Here's what most people don't know. Cybersecurity your organization or your business, general liability does not cover breaches. So the average, I think there was a guy or somebody was saying that the average cost of a breach now is categorized to be about $178,000. But your general liability does not cover that breach. So are you properly insured? That's one of the things that I think as an organization, that's what we do, is that we ask companies, are you properly insured? Do you have cybersecurity liability insurance? Well, 95% of the companies, based upon statistics, are going to say, no, we don't. And so it's like, okay, well, this is going to actually can be detrimental to your business, especially in the SMB market. I may not necessarily have, $178,000 at my disposal. So how do I cover the cost of the breach? Well, the thing is that I think the statistic is that 60% of the small and medium-sized businesses do not recover from breach because of all the costs, all the notifications, all of the things that they need to go through in the systems that they need to fix. So we ask them about cybersecurity liability insurance. That's kind of one of the first things we do. And then we actually go and say, okay, let's go through and I think that this is the second thing that I want to say, which is actually kind of what we do. And I think that organizations should be thinking about is you had a whole bunch of tools. That toolkit didn't work. Pretty much you have to take that and kind of move that aside and say, how do we put the right tools in place? Well, to answer that question, you have to ask yourself, do I have a risk management program or framework? Did I take and do a cursory test or review of those controls? And do I know where my deficiencies and my weaknesses are? That is really the right approach to take to understand the cybersecurity tools that you should implement, and then ensure that those controls and those risks have been addressed by putting in a proper compliance program. So that's what I think, if I could kind of tie it up in a bow, I think that's the one thing that I can tell people are those two key takeaways.
Thank you. That's really helpful and really appreciate that. Do you want to just quickly tell people what cybersec services are, what you guys do?
Right. So I think you covered it at the beginning of the program. But what we do, as we do all three, we start with, I think many companies, consulting companies that are out there, they go through and they implement technology, and we have partnerships with IBM and Microsoft and Cisco, Dell. We have partnerships with these organizations. So we have technologies that we have access and exposure to go through and implement those on behalf of, with our partners and clients, for our clients. Where I think where we kind of, we don't look at cybersecurity as just the answer. We look at it from a perspective of, let's start with the recipe. Using the cake analogy, getting back to the cake analogy, we start with the recipe, and the recipe is, excuse me, it is start with risk management. Start with looking at what your risks are organizationally, and then take those risks, um, review those risks in a cursory type of way, and use that to determine what tools you should implement. Implementing the right tool in the right place in the right order is paramount to ensuring that your that you are not exposed to a breach. And that's kind of what we do.
Thank you. I'll make this really quick. So Hyperproof, we are compliance operations software, and our mission is to help companies maintain a consistent compliance program day to day in the most efficient and productive way. So our view is that, risk assessments are really important. But, even when organizations do have really solid risk assessment methodology and treatment plans in place, if they are not able to implement their strategy and ensure that controls are assigned to the right people and are operating effectively day to day, then their risks are not fully mitigated in reality. And we know that, we've seen from our customers, managing a compliance program consistently day to day is very hard to do and very time consuming if it's in tools like Excel and project management systems. And so we've identified kind of those repetitive activities around monitoring and around preparing for audits. And we're helping people do those things more efficiently. So that's a little bit about Hyperproof. And thank you for being here. Let's get through questions. Okay, so
Sure.
One question here from Solomon. Could you please talk about the workforce demand and pipelines to meet the needs? What do you suggest to mid-career changers to guarantee next job as you suggested?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I think I'll use Dr. Bordon Strick's advice to me, which was you never take a job until you know what your next job is going to be. So the reality is that if you are in a place where, let's say you're trying to get into cybersecurity, well, I think the biggest thing that, and kind of what you want to do is that you want to try to get to a place where you are kind of what you're doing is that you start with what I call low-hanging fruit. So what that means is that you actually go through and get a certification. CompTIA Security Plus is a great certification to get, and that can get you into a place where people look at you and begin to start thinking about how you can get into a cybersecurity job. There's a whole statistic, whole place out there. Cyberseek.org is a great place to go. It is someplace to actually go through and look at how to get into cybersecurity and what the roles are and what the entry points are into getting into the cybersecurity fold. And as far as resources, I believe the last time I looked is that, this is a big thing. They're projecting that 3.2 million jobs will be open by 2022, 2023. And so where the challenge lies is there is currently, it's actually considered, and this is something you won't hear in the news, but if you actually go through and look at it, the president actually put together a committee back in 2017 because this is actually considered a national threat. The next generation of war, in my opinion, is already occurring in cyberspace. And where the challenge lies is actually going through and finding good people to actually help fight this war. So I hope that answers your question. And if not, just send me an email and Sure, go ahead.
So this question is about cyber insurance. What is the point of buying insurance when insurance companies have a full exclusion on covered incidents when the company cannot prove that they are fully compliant with risk management in addition to having ongoing assessments?
That's a great question. And so I think that's where the challenge is as well, too. In an ideal world, and you have to think about this from a SOC 1, SOC 2, ISO 27001, the reason why many organizations actually go through and get those qualified opinion reports is because they want to prove that they are compliant. So that's where it's important to have an organization that is actually going through, making sure you have a risk management program in place, taking those controls and testing those controls, and then making sure that you have the proper tools and technologies, and you are going through and monitoring those controls on a semi-frequent basis. So that is probably one of the things that I don't think insurance companies are doing this yet, but eventually what they're going to start doing, I believe, as they start seeing risk, as they start seeing those kinds of things happen, and we have more and more events. Remember, cybercrime is supposed to grow up to $6 trillion a year by next year, which will be the largest transfer of wealth in the history of mankind, according to Cybersec Ventures. The idea is that it's going to become, insurance companies are not going to want to pay claims. So even if you have cybersecurity insurance, they could begin to start coming at you and saying, how do you minimize your risk, and do you have a risk management framework in place? And if you don't, we can't pay your claim. I think that's in the future.
That's really interesting. Okay, so those are the questions I've seen coming in, and we are at time. So with that, let's just wrap up. Thank you very much, James, for joining me today. Really appreciate all this information, and I really hope the audience listening found this useful for you guys.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it, and hopefully we'll do it again sometime.
That would be great. All right, have a good day and take care.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.